So here's a big question for you. What really separates those companies, the ones that achieve truly great results, sustained over decades, from the ones that just stay? Well, good, or maybe even fail.
That's pretty much the fundamental question, isn't it, in business and any organization, really.
Yeah, is greatness something you're just sort of born with as a company? Or can you actually consciously build it?
Right. Is it luck?
I think
Genius?
so.
Or is it something more systematic, something you can, understand and actually do?
Exactly. And that's why we're doing this deep dive today. We're digging into a really significant piece of research, a huge effort that tackled this exact question.
Yeah, a 5-year project, I believe.
Yeah.
Super rigorous,
Mm.
looking at companies that made this very specific leap from just being good performers to achieving and, importantly, sustaining really great results.
The goal wasn't just to find successful companies, right? It was about figuring out what changed.
Precisely. What were the mechanisms, the disciplines, the patterns that let some make that jump when others, often facing the same kinds of challenges,
Yeah.
just didn't?
Okay, so our mission for this deep dive is to unpack the key findings. We want to look at the maybe unexpected patterns they found, some conclusions that kind of go against the grain, the conventional wisdom.
And the principles that seem to be consistently there, working behind the scenes in these companies that hit that spectacular, sustained level of performance.
We'll get into how they even identified these good to great companies, and maybe just as important, what they learned by comparing them, side by side with similar companies that didn't make that leap or couldn't keep it going.
Yeah, the comparisons are absolutely crucial to the whole thing.
So let's start at the beginning. How did this whole quest, this search for greatness, how did it kick off? What was the spark?
Well, it actually started with a challenge, a
Okay.
really direct question from a consultant named Bill Meehan. He essentially asked, can a good company really become a great one? And if it can, how?
Hmm.
He kind of wondered if just being good wasn't some kind of disease, I think was his word.
Yeah.
It's like something that most companies just couldn't cure.
The disease of just being good.
Yeah.
Wow, that's quite a way to put it. It suggests being average isn't just okay, it's actively holding you back.
It really does. And the researchers, they weren't interested in just anecdotes or stories about companies that were always great from the start. They wanted answers that were ideally universal,
Mhm.
principles that could apply to any kind of organization.
Any organization, not just businesses.
Well, that was the hope. But they chose to focus the actual research on publicly traded corporations.
Why corporations specifically? Was there an advantage there?
Yeah, mainly practicality. You get a pretty clear, relatively objective definition of great results, long-term stock returns way above the market, plus there's tons of public data available.
Okay.
The idea was to use these companies almost like a black box, as they put it. Look inside, figure out the factors that create enduring greatness, hoping those factors would apply more broadly.
Right. So the core question was about transformation, using stock performance as the main yardstick. How did they actually find the companies? What was the methodology?
It was intense, really rigorous, multi-stage. They wanted it to be as objective as possible. They started with a huge pool. Every company that hit the Fortune 500 list at any point between 1965 and 1995.
30 years worth of Fortune 500 companies? That's massive.
It is. And then they did what they called a 6-month death march of financial analysis, seriously digging through decades of data.
Wow.
They were looking for a very specific pattern. They needed companies with a 17-year history. In the first 2 years, their stock returns had to be at or below the general market average.
Okay, so starting from average or even below.
Exactly. And then for the next 15 years straight, their cumulative stock returns had to be at least 3 times the general market.
3 times the market for 15 years. That's
Yeah.
that's a seriously high bar, sustained outperformance.
It really is. And they had this other crucial filter. This knocked out a lot of companies. They excluded any company where the entire industry showed that same kind of jump.
Ah, so it had to be the company itself, not just riding a booming industry wave?
Exactly. That was key. They had to isolate companies that made the leap because of internal stuff, their own actions, their disciplines, not just external luck or being in the right sector at the right time.
They wanted companies where greatness was like chosen, built, not just inherited.
That's the core idea. They did actually debate other ways to define greatness. Social impact, employee happiness, reputation, that sort of thing.
Yeah, you could argue those matter too.
Absolutely. But for this study, they decided to stick strictly to that financial results pattern. Their thinking was adding other factors would bring in their own biases about what they thought was good or great. The specific question they were tackling was about transforming financial performance from good to great and keeping it there.
Okay, that makes sense. Focus on one clear definition for the research. So, after all that filtering, which companies actually made the final cut?
They ended up with 11 companies that met all those tough criteria. Let's see. Abbott Laboratories, Circuit City, Fannie Mae, Gillette, Kimberly-Clark, Kroger, Nucor, Philip Morris, Pitney Bowes, Walgreens, and Wells Fargo.
That's quite a mix. Healthcare, retail, finance, consumer goods. Some familiar names, some maybe less so now, but clearly, based on the numbers, they were extraordinary performers for a long stretch.
Totally. And just to give you a sense of how extraordinary, they calculated that if you put $1 in a general stock market fund in 1965, and then for each of these 11 companies, right at their transition point, you swapped your market stock for their stock and held it till 2000.
Okay.
That $1 would have grown to $471.
Oh, wow. And the market?
If you just left the dollar in the general market fund, it would have grown to $56.
471 versus 56. Okay, yeah. That definitely puts the great results part in perspective. That's huge.
It really, really is. But, to figure out why these 11 made the leap and others didn't, they absolutely needed comparison points.
Yeah.
This is maybe the most critical part of the methodology.
Right, the control group.
Exactly. They end up studying 28 companies in total, the 11 good to great ones, plus 11 direct comparison companies, and 6 unsustained comparison companies.
How did they pick those comparisons? Seems like getting that right is vital for drawing conclusions.
Oh, absolutely vital. They were super careful. They had 6 criteria to match them up. They looked for companies that were really similar to the good to great ones at the time the good to great company started its transformation.
Similar how?
Things like business fit, same basic industry or products. Size fit, similar revenue. Age fit, founded around the same time. Stock trend fit, similar stock performance before the transition point. Control point fit, like were they both capital intensive or heavily regulated. And finally, data sufficiency fit, just could they get enough historical data on them?
So they were looking for peers? Companies facing similar challenges, similar environments?
Exactly. Peers that either never made that leap to great results, those were the direct comparisons, or maybe they had a burst of success but couldn't sustain it. Those were the unsustained ones.
Okay, so they had the group that made it and carefully matched groups that didn't. What kind of information, what raw material did they gather on all of them?
Oh, it was colossal.
Yeah.
They gathered basically every article published about these 28 companies, go back 50 years or more in some cases. Nearly 6,000 articles.
6,000 articles.
Yeah. Then they did deep, structured interviews with key executives from that transition era, from both the good to great and the comparison companies. That generated over 2,000 pages of transcripts.
Okay.
And they compiled just mountains of computer data, 384 million bytes, financial ratios, management turnover rates, acquisitions, executive pay, you name it.
That sounds like just an overwhelming amount of information. How did they even begin to make sense of it all?
They described it like trying to step inside a black box and start turning on light bulbs one by one. It wasn't neat or linear. It was messy, iterative, lots of debate.
I bet.
The research team basically read, coded, and categorized everything for each company, put it all into these huge binders and databases, organized by theme strategy, tech, leadership, culture, finance, everything. Then they'd have these intense weekly team debates, presenting findings, challenging each other, arguing, trying to pull out the real patterns. They called it moving from architects of chaos to concept.
Architects of chaos to concept. I love that. Sounds like you have to wade through a ton of noise to find the signal.
That's exactly it. And they set a really, really high bar for what actually counted as a finding that would make it into their final framework.
What was the standard?
Okay, so a concept or a pattern had to show up as a clear change variable in 100% every single one of the good to great companies during those crucial transition years.
100% where?
And just as critically, that same pattern had to show up in less than 30% of the comparison companies during that same time frame.
100% of the winners, less than 30% of the comparisons. That is a seriously tough filter. No room for ambiguity there.
Not much, no. It meant they weren't just looking at averages or general tendencies. They needed clear, distinct patterns that really separated the good to great companies from the others.
And did this strict approach lead to some surprises? Things that didn't make the cut?
Oh, big time. This led to some of the most interesting stuff, what they called the dogs that didn't bark.
The dogs that didn't bark? Meaning?
Meaning the things you absolutely expected to find based on all the usual business talk, but the data just didn't back them up as differentiators.
Oh, okay. Like what? Give me an example.
Well, probably the biggest one. The data did not support the idea that you need some larger-than-life celebrity CEO, especially one brought in from outside, to make this transformation happen.
Really? But that's the story you always hear, the turnaround artist, the star CEO.
Right. But the good to great companies were almost always led by these, well, more understated executives, often promoted from within. 10 out of the 11 good to great CEOs came from inside the company. Meanwhile, the comparison companies, they tried bringing in outside CEOs 6 times more often.
6 times more often. That completely flips this savior from outside narrative on its head.
Totally. Another big surprise. Specific types of executive compensation. It just wasn't a distinguishing factor. They looked at everything, stock options, bonus plans, how much CEOs made versus others.
Yeah.
No systematic pattern linking pay structure to going from good to great.
So it wasn't how they were paid or even necessarily how much that made the difference. It was something else about them or the organization.
Seems like it. And strategy, just having a strategy itself. Also not the key differentiator. Both groups, good to great and comparison, had strategies, often very detailed plans.
So everyone had a plan.
Pretty much. The difference wasn't having a strategy or even spending more time planning. It was something else about how they got to it or how they executed it. We'll definitely get more into that.
Okay, so not celebrity leaders, not fancy pay packages, not just having a strategy document. What else didn't bark?
Technology. Huge surprise for many. Tech played almost no role in actually igniting the transformation.
No role. But we hear so much about tech disruption.
It could be a massive accelerator later on once the momentum was there, but it wasn't the initial spark. Not in these cases. Similarly, M&A mergers and acquisitions, not found to be a key factor in starting the transformation.
Mm-hmm.
The data basically suggested you can't just buy your way to greatness by smashing 2 okay companies together. As they put it, 2 big mediocrities joined together never make one great company.
So no acquiring your way there. And tech wasn't the magic bullet at the start. More conventional wisdom out the window.
Seems so. They also found the good to great companies paid very little attention to formal change management programs. Big initiatives to motivate people or create alignment as separate things.
They didn't need those.
The research suggested that if you get the other fundamentals right, those problems kind of take care of themselves. They didn't seem to need big, splashy, consultant-led programs with catchy taglines. Maybe most striking. The good to great companies had no special name, no tagline, no big launch event for their transformations. Many of the executives interviewed weren't even fully aware of the scale of what they were doing until they look back later. It felt more like organic evolution than some declared revolution.
Wow. No fanfare, just results.
That's what the data pointed to. And finally, these companies weren't necessarily in glamorous or easy industries. Some were in brutal commodity businesses, facing really tough competition, regulation.
So it wasn't about being in the right industry.
No, which led them to this powerful early conclusion. Greatness isn't mainly about your circumstances. It's not about being in the right place at the right time. It's largely a matter of conscious choice and discipline, whatever hand you're dealt.
That's actually really empowering, isn't it? It's not just luck of the draw. Okay, so if it wasn't all those conventional things, what did they find? Let's dig into that first major finding.
Okay, the first big one, and maybe the most surprising given what we just said about celebrity leaders, was about the type of leader who was actually in charge during that good to great shift.
Right, you said not the famous saviors. So who are they? These quiet internal hires.
They found this distinct pattern. They called it level 5 leadership. It's the top level in this sort of hierarchy of executive capabilities they mapped out.
Level 5, what does that mean?
Okay, a level 5 leader, they found, embodies this really interesting paradox. They blend extreme personal humility with intense professional will.
Extreme humility and intense professional will.
Okay, that sounds contradictory. How does that actually play out?
Well, they were often kind of self-effacing, quiet, maybe reserved. They didn't seek the limelight, rarely talked about themselves. But underneath that quiet exterior was this absolutely ferocious, unwavering resolve. They'd do whatever it took for however long it took to make the company succeed.
So the ambition wasn't for themselves. Exactly. Their ambition was channeled outward into building the institution, making it great, setting it up for success long after they were gone. Not inward, towards personal fame or fortune or ego gratification.
Though they often got the fortune anyway, right, as a byproduct.
Often, yes. But it wasn't the primary driver. It was a result of building something great.
Can you paint a picture? Give us an example of a level 5 leader.
Darwin Smith at Kimberly-Clark is sort of the classic example. He was an in-house lawyer, described as mild-mannered, shy, even a bit awkward, not flashy at all. Early on as CEO, he gets diagnosed with cancer, told he has less than a year. He actually lived much longer, but imagine facing that. Wow. Despite all that, his professional will was just off the charts. He made what some call the gutsiest decision in the whole study. He sold off Kimberly-Clark's traditional paper mills, their core business for ages, basically burned the boats.
Sold the mills. To do what?
To take the company head-to-head against giants like P&G and Scott Paper, consumer paper products, business diapers, tissues, stuff like that. A hugely competitive market.
That takes incredible guts, especially for someone described as mild-mannered, selling the company's heritage to jump into the fire like that.
Absolutely. And he wasn't looking for applause. He just seemed deeply convinced that Kimberly-Clark could be great in consumer goods. He worked tirelessly, often behind the scenes, and they absolutely crushed it. Outperformed P&G and Scott combined over the next 15 years.
Incredible. What about Coleman Mockler at Gillette? You mentioned him.
Yeah, Mockler. Another quiet, reserved, almost sort of patrician guy. But when Gillette faced these repeated hostile takeover bids from really aggressive raiders like Ronald Perelman.
Right, the 80s corporate raiders.
Exactly. Mockler fought them off with just this unwavering resolve. He could have easily taken the money, sold the company, made himself and shareholders a quick fortune. But he believed deeply in Gillette's long-term potential, its ability to innovate and create value. His commitment to the institution's future was stronger than the lure of personal gain. That's professional will.
So it's that quiet dedication to the company's long-term health, even when a quick personal win is on the table.
That's it. David Maxwell at Fannie Mae is another great example. Took over when they were losing $1 million a day.
Yeah.
Transformed it into this high-performance engine, a financial powerhouse.
Yeah.
But when he retired, right at the peak of his success, he was genuinely worried that his own large retirement package might cause controversy and hurt the company's reputation.
He actually worked proactively to try and mitigate that potential damage, again showing his primary ambition was for the institution, not himself.
These guys sound so different from the comparison leaders you mentioned, like Stanley Galt or Chainsaw Al Dunlap.
Night and day.
Yeah.
Stanley Galt at Rubbermaid. Brilliant guy, no doubt. Charismatic. A classic level 4 leader, drove amazing results while he was there. But people described him as egocentric, a sincere tyrant. Lots of I, not much we.
Okay.
And while he was amazing while he was there, Rubbermaid basically collapsed after he left. Why? Because he hadn't built a strong management team that could carry on without him. The company was more of a platform for his genius, not a self-sustaining great organization. That sounds like that genius with 1,000 helpers model you mentioned.
Exactly that. A lot of the comparison companies seem to rely on one incredibly brilliant individual. Jack Eckert at Eckert Drugs, Henry Singleton at Teledyne. Super smart, highly capable leaders. But the organization was kind of built around them. When the genius left, the company often stumbled because the people below were more like implementers, not necessarily leaders developed to take over.
So, level 5 leaders build companies that can be great after they leave, while the level 4 genius leaders build companies that are great while they're there. Is that a fair summary?
That's a really key distinction, yeah. The level 5's ambition is for the company's enduring greatness, whether they're running it or not. And finding that these level 5 types were the rule, not the exception, in the good to great transitions was just a huge insight.
Okay, so level 5 leadership is the foundation. What was the next big finding, especially about the people inside the organization?
This one is captured by a phrase that sounds simple, but is incredibly profound. First who, then what?
First who, then what? Okay.
Most of us assume, right, that great leaders start with a big vision. They craft the brilliant strategy, then they go out and get the right people to execute that vision.
Yeah, that's the standard playbook, isn't it? Figure out where you're going, then assemble the crew to get you there.
That's absolutely what the researchers expected to find. But the data showed the complete opposite pattern in the good to great companies.
The opposite.
Yeah. Their leaders didn't start with the vision or the strategy. Their first, number one priority was getting the right people on the bus, getting the wrong people off the bus, and getting the right people into the right seats on the bus.
Wait, what?
Then, and only then, did they collectively figure out where they were going to drive the bus.
So, people first, destination second. That feels really backwards. Seriously counterintuitive.
It totally is. That old management saying people are your most important asset, this research suggests it's not quite right. It's more like the right people are your most important asset.
Okay, why? Why is putting who before what so critical? What's the logic?
The research pointed to three sort of simple but really powerful truths. First, adaptability. If people are on the bus, mainly because of who else is on it, the quality of their colleagues, the shared commitment, then it's way easier to change direction when you hit roadblocks or see new opportunities.
Ah, because they trust the team, not just the original plan.
Exactly. If they only signed up because of where the bus was supposedly going initially, you'll have a huge problem, maybe a mutiny, when the strategy inevitably needs to shift.
Okay, so the right people are more flexible because they're committed to the group. What else?
Second, if you have the right people on board, the whole problem of how to motivate and manage them, it pretty much dissolves.
Really?
The right people don't need tight management or constant pep talks. They are self-motivated. They have this internal drive to produce the best results, to be part of creating something excellent.
They bring their own engine, basically, so the leader isn't constantly having to push.
That's the idea. And third, and this is maybe the starkest point, if you have the wrong people on the bus, it literally does not matter how brilliant your strategy or vision is. You just won't be able to execute it well enough to build a great company. Great vision without great people is, well, kind of irrelevant in practice.
Okay, can you give some examples of this first who principle in action?
Sure. Think back to David Maxwell at Fannie Mae. Takes over, company's bleeding $1 million a day. Huge pressure. Fix it now. Developed strategy yesterday.
Yeah, immense pressure.
But what was his first priority? Interviewing all the officers. Figuring out who was on the bus, who needed to get off, making those tough people decisions to get the right leadership team assembled before he finalized any big strategic moves.
Even staring down that massive daily loss, the people came first. That takes serious conviction.
It really shows how deeply they believe this. Or Dick Cooley and later Carl Reichert at Wells Fargo. They put enormous energy into building just a superior team right from the start. They trusted that if they had the right people, they'd figure out where to take the bank, even as the whole industry was being turned upside down by deregulation. Or look at Circuit City versus its direct comparison, Silo. Alan Wurtzel at Circuit City spent his early years obsessing over hiring and developing the absolute best management team in retail. He even focused on getting the right delivery drivers, people who fit their culture.
Really, down to the drivers.
Yeah. Meanwhile, Silo CEO, mostly focused on real estate deals, store locations. Circuit City obsessed over people, Silo obsessed over physical assets. Circuit City made the great leap, Silo eventually disappeared.
That contrast is really telling. It wasn't about the stores, it was about the people in the stores, managing them, driving the trucks.
And this loops right back to that genius with 1,000 helpers idea. The comparison companies often hinged on the genius. The good to great companies were built around the team.
Right. The genius model might work for a while, but it doesn't last because it's not about building a team that outlasts the genius.
Exactly. It fails at succession, fails at building an institution.
You said earlier that executive pay wasn't a key differentiator. How does that connect with first two?
It reinforces it perfectly. They found no evidence you could, engineer great performance just by designing clever compensation plans. The right people, they argued, are motivated more intrinsically.
Hey, what?
By the chance to contribute, to build something excellent, to be part of a winning team. Compensation matters. Sure, you need to be fair, attract and keep good people, but it's not the primary driver of that extra discretionary effort that leads to greatness.
So pay aligns incentives for the right people, but the motivation's already baked in?
That's the idea. Think of Nucor's very egalitarian bonus system, tied directly to team productivity. It worked brilliantly for them because they hired a specific kind of person and built a culture where that shared goal of efficient steelmaking was the intrinsic driver. The pay system supported it, but didn't create it.
Okay. And getting the right people on the bus and the wrong people off. That sounds like it could get tough. You mentioned being rigorous, not ruthless.
Yes, a really important distinction.
What's the difference?
Okay, ruthless is maybe hacking and cutting indiscriminately, especially when times get tough. Maybe driven by panic, not deep thought. Rigorous, though, is about consistently applying demanding standards all the time, at all levels, and importantly, applying them to management first. It's about making sure everyone on the bus is capable and pulling their weight towards that standard of excellence.
Can you give an example of rigor?
The Wells Fargo acquisition of Crocker Bank is a classic, if controversial one. They let go 1,600 Crocker managers on day one.
Ouch, sounds ruthless.
From the outside, maybe? But Wells Fargo execs saw it as rigorous. They knew, based on their standards, that these managers just wouldn't fit the high-performance, cost-conscious Wells Fargo culture. Keeping them on, letting them twist in the wind with uncertainty, they argued that would have been more damaging, maybe even more ruthless in the long run. Deal with it up front, let people move on, and integrate the assets with the people who fit.
And they applied that rigor to themselves, too.
Oh yeah. Long before Crocker, they were cutting their own executive perks, freezing salaries. The rigor started at the top.
So rigor is about tough standards, consistently applied, starting with yourself, all in service of building the best team.
That's the essence. And it's not just getting people on the bus, it's getting them in the right seats.
Meaning?
Good to great companies consistently put their absolute best people on their biggest opportunities, not their biggest problem.
Oh, interesting. Most companies put their stars on the fires, right?
Often, yeah. But the comparison companies did that more. The good to great logic was different. Solving problems only gets you back to zero, makes you good again. Building on opportunities, that's what makes you great.
Give me an example.
Joe Coleman at Philip Morris. He took one of his most capable executives, George Weissman, and put him in charge of the tiny, almost forgotten international division. That was their biggest opportunity. Weissman built it into a global giant. A comparison company might have thrown Weissman at whatever the biggest domestic crisis was that week.
That requires people to put the company's potential ahead of their own division or maybe even their own comfort zone.
It absolutely does. It requires loyalty to the enterprise's best future. And underlying all this first who stuff, there was often this distinct vibe, this culture within the good to great executive teams.
What kind of a...
Real camaraderie, but also intense debate. They argued fiercely, not to win personally, but because they were all passionately trying to find the best answer for the company. One exec at Philip Morris described it, saying something like, they never agreed on anything. They'd fight and yell and scream. But when a decision emerged, all the debates were for the common good, not for self-aggrandizement. There was this foundation of respect and shared commitment. People genuinely seemed to enjoy working together, striving together.
So that first pillar is really all about the people. Level 5 leaders focused on the company and this relentless discipline around getting the right people in the right seats first.
That's the bedrock. Disciplined people.
Okay, so if you have disciplined people, that foundation then leads into the second major finding, which sounds like it's about facing the cold, hard truth. It's called the Stockdale Paradox.
Yeah. Confront the brutal facts, yet never lose faith. This really came alive when they compared companies like A&P and Kroger in the grocery business back in the 70s.
Yeah. What was the story there?
Both were old-school giants. Both had tons of assets tied up in traditional, outdated grocery stores. Both knew, intellectually at least, that customers were moving fast towards bigger superstores with more variety, better prices.
So they both saw the brutal fact. The market was changing dramatically.
They saw it.
Yeah.
But their reactions, totally different. A&P basically stuck its head in the sand. They ran experiments, like this golden key store that clearly showed what worked, what customers wanted. But the execs didn't like the answers because it meant dismantling their old model. So what did they do?
Let me guess.
Ignored it. They shut the experiments down. Then they just lurched from one failed strategy to another. Price cuts, pep rallies, new slogans, desperately trying to prop up a dying model. They chose comfortable delusion over uncomfortable reality.
Wow, just actively avoided the truth because it was painful.
Pretty much. Kroger, on the other hand, they systematically confronted that brutal fact. The old grocery store was toast. They went through this incredibly painful, long process of rebuilding their entire system around the superstore concept.
That must have been gut-wrenching, closing hundreds of stores.
Absolutely. They essentially had to replace almost their entire asset base over time. Hugely expensive, risky. But they faced reality head-on and acted decisively.
Ran the results.
Kroger became the #1 grocery chain in America. A&P basically faded into irrelevance. It's just such a stark illustration of denial versus confrontation. And that pattern held. Breakthrough results in the good to great companies didn't come from some magical visionary leap that ignored the facts. They came from a series of good decisions, stacked one on top of another, all built on relentlessly confronting the brutal truth of their situation.
So it's more about grounded realism than just bold dreaming.
If the dreams ignore reality, yes. Pitney Bowes versus Adressograph after they both lost their monopolies. Same story. Pitney Bowes became almost neurotic, constantly questioning its reality, figuring out how to reinvent itself. Adressograph had this charismatic, visionary CEO, Roy Ash, who just ignored mounting evidence that his grand diversification plan was failing, and he drove the company into the ground.
It sounds like humility towards reality is key. How did the good to great leaders actually create a climate where people felt they could speak the truth, even bad news?
Yeah, that's crucial. It doesn't just happen. They found several common practices. First, leaders led with questions, not answers.
Questions first.
Yeah. Instead of starting with, here's my vision, leaders like Alan Wurtzel at Circuit City just constantly probed.
Yeah.
Why? 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 He famously asked his board more questions than they asked him. The goal wasn't to blame or push an agenda, it was genuine understanding.
So curiosity driving the conversation, not assertion.
Exactly. Second, they encouraged vigorous dialogue and debate, created environments where people could argue passionately, hash things out, even if it got uncomfortable. Remember that Philip Morris quote, arguing for the common good. They weren't afraid of conflict if it surfaced the truth.
Okay, sounds intense, but if the goal is truth, maybe necessary.
It seemed to be. Third, they conducted autopsies without blame. When things went wrong, like Philip Morris buying 7-Up, which was a flop, they took it apart clinically. Why did it fail? What can we learn? No finger pointing. The CEO, Joe Coleman, even took personal responsibility in his own book. That lack of blame encourages honesty next time.
Creates psychological safety to admit mistakes and learn.
Right. And fourth, they sometimes built what the researchers called red flag mechanisms, systems that turned information into something you simply could not ignore.
Red flag mechanisms, like what?
The most extreme example was a construction company called Granite Rock. Their CEO, Bruce Wolpert, set up a short pay system. Customers could literally cross things off their invoice and pay less if they weren't satisfied, sending an unmissable red flag right to the manager responsible.
Wow, that's direct.
It is. Now, the good to great companies didn't always have something quite that dramatic, but they fostered climates where uncomfortable truths got surfaced and had to be dealt with. The point is to make critical information unavoidable.
These all seem designed to fight that natural human instinct to kind of shy away from bad news.
Absolutely. And this brings us right to the core psychological insight here. The Stockdale Paradox.
Okay, tell me about Admiral Stockdale.
Admiral Jim Stockdale was the highest-ranking U.S. officer held in the Hanoi Hilton POW camp in Vietnam. 8 years. Horrific conditions, torture, total uncertainty.
Hard to imagine.
He observed something fascinating about who survived and who didn't. It wasn't the optimists. The optimists were the ones saying, we'll be out by Christmas. Christmas comes, they're still there. Okay, we'll be out by Easter. Easter passes. Eventually, Stockdale said they died of a broken heart.
That's incredibly bleak. So who did survive?
The ones who survived, Stockdale realized, held onto two contradictory beliefs simultaneously. One, unwavering faith that they would prevail in the end. They would get out, and they would turn the experience into a defining one. And two, they confronted the most brutal facts of their current reality head-on, no matter how grim.
So absolute faith in the end game combined with absolute realism about the present nightmare.
That's the paradox. Faith in facts. Not hope versus despair, but this powerful psychological discipline. And the researchers found this exact duality in every single good to great leader during their toughest times.
Every single one.
Everyone. They all face huge adversity. Fannie Mae's losses, Gillette's takeover battles, Nucor fighting cheap imports, Kroger gutting its stores, but they all held that unwavering faith. We will prevail as a great company. And they had the discipline to stare the brutal facts in the face. Look at Fannie Mae again. Brutal fact. Crippling interest rate risk causing those massive losses. They didn't just hope rates would change. That's the failed optimist path. They accepted the reality and disciplined themselves to become world-class at managing that risk, even inventing new financial tools to do it. Confront the fact. Maintain the faith.
That's a really powerful mindset. Face reality square on, but never, ever lose faith you'll ultimately succeed.
It seems essential for navigating the really tough stretches of transformation.
Okay, so we have the right people on the bus, finding one, and they're committed to confronting brutal facts while keeping faith. Finding two. Where did these companies go next?
That leads directly to the third big finding. The Hedgehog Concept.
A hedgehog concept. Okay, sounds intriguing.
It comes from this old Greek parable made famous by the philosopher Isaiah Berlin in an essay. The basic idea is, the fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing.
The fox is scattered, the hedgehog is focused.
That's the essence. Foxes pursue many different goals and strategies at once, often contradictory, complex. Hedgehogs simplify a complex world into a single central vision, a unifying idea that guides everything they do.
And the good to great companies were hedgehogs.
Overwhelmingly, yes. They attained this simple yet profoundly insightful concept about their business, and they stuck to it relentlessly. It became their guiding principle. Comparison companies more often acted like foxes chasing multiple opportunities, getting tangled in complexity, diversifying into areas where they really had no business being, like a dressograph buying all those unrelated companies.
So it's about finding that one big thing that simplifies and focuses everything. How did they define this hedgehog concept more specifically?
It's not just any simple idea. It
Hmm.
has to be derived from understanding the intersection of three key circles, three fundamental questions.
Okay, what are the three circles?
Circle one, what can you be the best in the world at?
Best in the world. Wow, that is a high bar. Not just good or competent.
Exactly. It's a brutally honest assessment. And just as important is figuring out what you cannot be the best at and having the discipline to stop doing those things, even if you're currently making money from them.
So, rigorous self-assessment about unique capability.
Yes. Wells Fargo, for instance, realized they couldn't beat Citicorp at being a global bank, but they figured they could be the best in the world at running a bank like a highly efficient business focused mainly on the Western U.S.
Hmm.
That became their hedgehog space. Abbott Labs knew they probably couldn't beat Merck in pure pharmaceutical discovery, but they realized they could be the best at developing and manufacturing cost-effective healthcare products, diagnostics, nutritionals. That was their circle.
So, defining your specific arena of potential world-class excellence. Got it. What's circle two?
Circle two is understanding what drives your economic engine. What is the key denominator, the single metric that has the greatest impact on your long-term economic results, usually expressed as profit per X or maybe cash flow per X in the social sector?
Profit per X. Can you give an example?
Sure. Walgreens figured out their key driver wasn't profit per store, which is how most retailers thought. It was profit per customer visit.
Huh. That simple shift changes everything.
It totally does. That insight drove their whole strategy, clustering stores for maximum convenience, drive-thrus, anything to increase those profitable customer visits. Wells Fargo, especially under deregulation, focused intensely on profit per employee, driving radical efficiency. Fannie Mae focused on profit per mortgage risk level, which highlighted their core skill in risk management. Nucor's was profit per ton of finished steel, capturing the essence of their culture and technology combined.
Understanding that single denominator sounds like it brings incredible clarity to where you should focus your resources and efforts.
Absolutely. It points right to the heart of your economic model. Okay, circle three.
What's the third one?
What are you deeply passionate about?
Can you just decide to be passionate about something?
No, that's the key. You can't manufacture passion or choose it based on market opportunity. You have to discover what truly motivates the people in the organization, what they genuinely care about.
So it has to be authentic.
Yes. And honestly, it doesn't really matter what you're passionate about as long as it's genuine and links to the other two circles. Philip Morris executives, the research found, were genuinely passionate about the business of tobacco and related products, despite the controversy. Gillette looked for people passionate about things like deodorant or razors. Nucor was passionate about its unique culture and beating bigger competitors. What is less important than the authenticity of the passion?
Okay, so the hedgehog concept is that sweet spot where three things overlap. What you can be best in the world at, what drives your economic engine, profit per X, and what you're deeply passionate about.
That's exactly it. And finding this intersection, it wasn't like a single aha moment or a weekend retreat. It was an iterative process,
How did they do it?
often through something the researchers called a council. Not necessarily a formal committee, but a group of the right people, typically led by the CEO. People who had the level 5 traits, who understood the first who principle, who could handle the brutal facts.
And what did this council do?
They'd meet regularly, maybe over months or years, asking the hard questions guided by the three circles. Engaging in that intense dialogue and debate we talked about, maybe running experiments, doing autopsies on failures. It was about continuous questioning, challenging assumptions, gradually building understanding. On average, it took the good to great companies about 4 years to really crystallize their hedgehog concept.
4 years. Wow, that requires patience.
It really does. It's about disciplined discovery, not just asserting some bold concept you haven't fully tested against reality. It's understanding, not just bravado.
And here's a key point from the research, right? Most of these companies weren't already best at anything when they started.
That's one of the most hopeful findings. The majority started out not being best in the world at anything obvious, but by combining that Stockdale Paradox faith plus brutal facts with the discipline of relentlessly asking the three circle questions, every single one of them did eventually find their unique hedgehog concept.
That's amazing. It means you don't need some obvious inherent advantage to start. You can find your path to greatness through disciplined inquiry.
It totally reframes potential. It's
Yeah.
about the discipline to uncover it, not necessarily having it handed to you.
Okay, so once a company gets clear on its hedgehog concept, that intersection of best at, economics, and passion, what happens then? How do they translate that clarity into those sustained great results?
That takes us right into the fourth major finding, which is all about building momentum. They use a great metaphor for this. The flywheel.
The flywheel. Explain that.
Think of a huge, heavy metal flywheel, maybe mounted horizontally on an axle. Getting it started takes immense effort, right? You push and push, and maybe it moves just a tiny bit. It's incredibly hard work for almost no visible result initially.
Right. Massive inertia to overcome.
Exactly. But you keep pushing, consistently, in the same direction. And slowly, incrementally, it starts to turn a little faster, then a bit faster still. You keep pushing. Eventually, you hit a point where the momentum you've built starts working for you. The flywheel's own weight helps it turn. And then it reaches a point of breakthrough. It's spinning rapidly, almost effortlessly, with unstoppable momentum.
Okay, I get the image. How does that relate to the companies?
The good to great transformations didn't happen overnight. There wasn't one single defining action, one grand program, one miracle moment that suddenly flipped the switch from good to great. It was much more like pushing that flywheel.
So slow, steady, cumulative effort, evolution, not revolution.
Precisely. It's a build-up to breakthrough model. The build-up phase is all that consistent pushing, accumulating knowledge, making disciplined decisions aligned with the hedgehog concept, getting the right people in the right seats, confronting facts, turn after turn after turn, often for years, with little external recognition.
And the breakthrough.
That's when the cumulative momentum hits a critical threshold, and the results become dramatic, visible, undeniable. The flywheel is really spinning.
Can you give an example of that long buildup?
Circuit City is perfect. They started tinkering with their warehouse showroom idea, the early Hedgehog concept, way back in the early 1970s. They didn't just roll it out nationally. They experimented, refined it, learned, pushed that flywheel for nearly a decade. It wasn't until 1982, after all that buildup, that they finally committed fully to the superstore concept. Then came the breakthrough, the explosive growth, the amazing stock returns.
So what looked like an overnight success to the outside world was actually the result of years and years of consistent pushing in one direction.
Exactly. Kimberly-Clark selling the mills. That was a huge, crucial push on their flywheel. But it was still just one big push in a cumulative process of shifting into consumer goods that had been going on for years.
And the executives didn't even see it as one moment.
Often not. When interviewed, they frequently couldn't point to a single launch date or key event. It felt more like, a whole bunch of interlocking pieces that built one upon another. The media loves the breakthrough story, but they usually miss the long, unglamorous build-up phase that made it possible.
So the key is that relentless discipline. Keep pushing consistently in the direction defined by the hedgehog concept.
Absolutely. Discipline is everything here. Even when things got really tough, Wells Fargo facing deregulation chaos, Fannie Mae bleeding cash, they stuck to the build-up model. They resisted the urge to make panicked, reactive moves or gamble on some miracle cure.
How did they maintain that long-term focus?
Abbott Labs had this system called Blue Plans. It was a mechanism to systematically allocate resources to future-oriented projects, things aligned with their hedgehog concept, even while managing the day-to-day pressures. It ensured they kept pushing the flywheel for the long haul.
So disciplined investment in the chosen path, protecting it from short-term crises.
That's the idea. Comparison companies, lacking that discipline or clarity, often did the opposite. They'd gamble on a single big hit, like Upjohn hoping the drug Rogaine alone would save them, trying to skip the hard work of the buildup.
And how does this steady pushing create the flywheel effect you mentioned?
Okay, as the flywheel gains momentum, even slowly at first, you start seeing tangible results. Small wins, but real progress. This demonstrates to everyone inside that the disciplined actions, guided by the hedgehog concept, are actually working.
So people see proof.
Exactly. And that generates excitement, belief, energy. People want to be part of something that's succeeding, something that's moving forward. As the researchers put it, people will line up with enthusiasm.
So the results themselves become the motivation.
Precisely. The right people, who are already self-motivated, get even more energized when they see their efforts contributing to visible progress. You don't need those big, separate change management initiatives or rah-rah motivational programs when the momentum itself becomes undeniable. It creates this virtuous cycle. Pushing leads to results. Results build momentum and energize people. Energized people push harder, leading to bigger results.
It feeds on itself. Momentum creates more momentum.
That's the flywheel effect.
Yeah.
And it stands in stark contrast to what they saw happening in the comparison companies. They call that the doom loop.
The doom loop. Sounds ominous.
It often was. Lacking that clear hedgehog concept or the discipline to stick with a buildup, comparison companies would frequently lurch erratically from one program to another, reacting to pressures without understanding, chasing fads, launching ill-conceived initiatives.
Just flailing around.
Kind of.
Yeah.
Or they'd undertake misguided acquisitions, trying to buy growth or greatness by bolting on unrelated businesses, which usually just made things worse. Remember, two big mediocrities. And very often, new leaders would come in, see the mess, and instead of trying to build on any potential momentum, they'd stop the flywheel dead, declare a whole new direction, start pushing a different flywheel, only to have that one stopped when the next leader arrived or the next crisis hit.
Oh, that sounds incredibly frustrating. All that effort constantly wasted, stopping and starting over and over.
Exhausting and totally unproductive. Warner Lambert was a class example. Constant restructurings, each new CEO bringing a different strategy. They never built any sustained momentum, just stayed stuck in the doom loop. Misguided acquisitions were a huge doom loop pattern. R.J. Reynolds buying a shipping company, an oil company. What did that have to do with their core? Leaders who constantly stopped the flywheel were endemic in the comparison companies.
So, flywheel. Consistent, disciplined pushes build unstoppable momentum. Doom loop. Chaotic lurching destroys momentum. Crystal clear contrast.
That's the core dynamic. One creates a positive cycle, the other a negative one, or just stagnation.
Okay, building on that theme of disciplined action, what was the final piece of the puzzle, the last major finding?
It ties everything together, really. It's about creating a culture of discipline.
A culture of discipline. What does that mean? Isn't discipline just about following rules?
Not primarily, no. In fact, the good to great companies tended to avoid bureaucracy, all those layers of rules and procedures. Bureaucracy often arises, the research suggests, to compensate for having the wrong people on the bus, for incompetence or lack of discipline.
Ah, so rules are needed when you can't trust people to do the right thing.
Often, yeah. Instead, the good to great companies focused on having disciplined people in the first place. Back to first who. Then they built a culture where those disciplined people could thrive and operate effectively. It's a culture that combines an ethic of entrepreneurship and freedom with rigorous accountability.
Freedom and accountability. How does that work?
George Rathman, who was at Abbott before founding Amgen, described the approach he learned there. You set objectives in concrete, absolutely clear, non-negotiable goals. You hold people rigorously accountable for hitting those goals, but you give them enormous freedom and autonomy on how they achieve them.
So tight on the what, loose on the how.
Exactly. Freedom and responsibility within a defined framework. Think of an airline pilot. They operate in an incredibly disciplined system. Checklists, air traffic control, strict protocols. But within that system, they have significant freedom and ultimate responsibility for critical decisions: take off, land, abort.
Okay, I see the analogy.
Good to great companies weren't necessarily as rigid as airlines, but they had a clear framework, usually the Hedgehog Concept, guiding decisions. Within that framework, disciplined people had the freedom to act and were held accountable for results. That's how Circuit City could stamp out consistent stores nationwide and scale so fast they had the right system and disciplined people operating effectively within it.
What else defined this culture of discipline?
They use this really memorable phrase, rinsing your cottage cheese.
Rinsing your cottage cheese. Where does that come from?
It's from the story of Dave Scott, the 6-time Ironman triathlon champion. The guy burned thousands of calories a day training, right? But he was so incredibly disciplined about every single detail, including his diet, that he would apparently rinse his cottage cheese to remove any extra fat.
Seriously, that sounds extreme.
It is extreme,
Yeah.
but it's an analogy. It represents this almost fanatical adherence to discipline, doing whatever it takes, focusing on continuous improvement in every small detail within your chosen hedgehog arena. It's about the cumulative power of many small disciplined steps applied relentlessly.
That dedication to the seemingly tiny things adding up over time.
Yes. Carl Reichert at Wells Fargo really embodied this. When he took over, he just ruthlessly attacked what he called banker mentality waste. Froze executive salaries, got rid of the fancy dining room, the corporate jet, even office plants and coffee service.
You cut the coffee.
He did. And crucially, he started with himself and his top team, rinsing their own cottage cheese first. That set the tone of extreme discipline and focus on cost effectiveness that spread through the whole organization. Compare that to executives at, say, Bank of America at the time, who were protecting their own perks even while the bank was struggling.
So discipline starts at the top, sets the example, and becomes part of the culture through consistent action.
That's it. It's discipline that actually supports entrepreneurship and freedom rather than stifling it with bureaucracy.
Now, alongside this culture of discipline, we need to talk about technology.
Right. You said earlier tech wasn't the cause of the transformation.
Correct. The data was very clear on that. Technology had basically nothing to do with igniting the good to great leap. But, and this is a big, but it was often found to be a hugely powerful accelerator once the flywheel was already spinning fast, once the hedgehog concept was clear.
Okay, so it pours fuel on an already burning fire, but doesn't start the fire itself. That's a great way to put it. Good to great companies were often pioneers in applying specific, carefully chosen technologies. But they did it after they understood their hedgehog concept, and often after they'd already hit breakthrough momentum. They weren't just adopting tech because it was new or because they were scared of missing out.
Can you give an example of that careful application?
Walgreens is perfect. They invested heavily in technology way before competitors. Things like their early computer network linking all the stores, advanced scanners, even using robotics in distribution centers, back when that was rare.
So they were tech pioneers.
In applying it, yes. But every single investment was directly tied back to their hedgehog concept of convenience and their economic engine of profit per customer visit. Their chief information officer, interestingly, was a pharmacist, not just a pure tech guru, emphasizing that the business need drove the tech choice.
That's telling.
And the dot-com boom hit. They didn't panic and just throw money online. They paused. They figured out how the internet fit their specific hedgehog concept of convenience, developed a strategy. They called it crawl, walk, run. Then they applied technology literally to accelerate their online pharmacy and became a leader there too. Disciplined adoption.
That makes so much sense. Strategy first, tech second, as an accelerator.
Exactly. Kroger, early adopter of barcode scanners. Why? Linked directly to better inventory management, which freed up massive amounts of cash, those crisp and crinkly dollar bills they talked about. Cash they then plowed into building their superstores, accelerating their hedgehog strategy. Gillette applied sophisticated laser welding, normally super high-tech, expensive stuff, to the mass production of shaving systems, created a unique proprietary tech advantage that protected their best-at-concept. Fannie Mae lagged in tech initially, but after hitting breakthrough and clarifying their risk management hedgehog, they became pioneers in using complex software for analyzing mortgage risk, directly accelerating their economic engine.
The pattern seems really consistent. Understand your core concept in economics, build momentum, then layer on technology strategically to push that specific flywheel faster.
Yeah, it's the core principle they found. Only apply technologies that link directly back to the three circles of your hedgehog concept. If it fits, be a pioneer in applying it. If it doesn't fit, aim for parity at best or just ignore it altogether. Don't get distracted by hype or fear.
And they stayed humble about tech.
Yeah, even pioneers like Ken Iverson at Nucor didn't list technology as the #1 factor for their success. He saw it as deeply integrated with their culture and people processes. The great companies remained disciplined, letting their understanding drive the technology, not the other way around.
These findings, the level 5 leaders' first two, confronting brutal facts with the Stockdale Paradox, the hedgehog concept, the flywheel momentum, the culture of discipline, and using tech as an accelerator, they're incredibly insightful and often quite counterintuitive.
But are they just for big public companies from that specific time period? How broadly do these ideas apply? That's such a crucial question. And the strong indication from the research and subsequent work is that these concepts are fundamentally universal. They're about what it takes to build an enduring great organization of any kind in almost any sector.
Any kind, like schools, nonprofits, government.
Yes. The underlying principles, getting disciplined people, engaging in disciplined thought, taking disciplined action, seem to be fundamental. They used corporations for the research because the data was accessible and comparable, allowing that rigorous analysis. But the insights themselves appear much broader.
Can you maybe illustrate that with a non-business example?
Sure. Think about, say, a really successful high school cross-country team. The coach probably applies first two. They select kids based not just on raw speed, but on character, discipline, work ethic, being coachable. People on the bus.
Okay.
Their hedgehog concept might be simple but powerful, like we run best at the end, meaning they train relentlessly to finish strong in workouts and races of the whole season.
Mm.
That's their best at, maybe their passion, and leads to winning their economic engine, metaphorically.
Right, a clear focus.
They build momentum, the flywheel, through consistent discipline training, day after day, week after week, pushing that run best at the end concept. They confront brutal facts. They don't ignore a bad race result. They analyze it honestly, autopsy without blame, adapt training, but they never lose faith they can improve and win. Stockdale Paradox.
And the flywheel effect.
As a team starts winning, seeing tangible results, that success attracts more of the right kind of dedicated, disciplined kids. The momentum builds, the talent pool deepens, accelerating further success. It maps really well.
That does resonate. Building a great team, clarifying your core strengths, applying discipline, building momentum. Okay, how does this good to great framework fit with other well-known ideas, like the research in Built to Last?
Right. Built to Last looked at companies that were already enduringly great, those truly iconic institutions that lasted generations.
Yeah, companies that had already made it.
Exactly. So good to great is often seen as the prequel. It explains the process of going from being just a solid, average company to achieving that first level of sustained, superior results over a decade or more. Built to Last then digs into what it takes to go from that stage to becoming a truly enduring, iconic company.
And what did Built to Last say was needed for that next leap?
It emphasized building a strong core ideology, meaning deeply held core values, and a purpose beyond just making money, combined with this dynamic of preserving that core ideology while simultaneously stimulating progress and change.
So the good to great principles kind of set the stage for those Built to Last ideas.
They really seem to. There's a strong connection that what you're passionate about, circle in the hedgehog concept. That overlaps a lot with discovering your core purpose and values. Having disciplined people who embody the core values, first two, is absolutely essential for preserving the core over the long haul, and the stability and momentum from the flywheel. That creates the foundation upon which you can instill values and purpose while still driving innovation and progress. Companies like Walmart or HP, featured in Built to Last, clearly showed many of these good to great principles in their earlier formative years.
Okay, so it's potentially a pathway. Good to great builds the engine, Built to Last adds the enduring soul and adaptability, but this still leaves that big question. Why bother? Why go through all this hard, disciplined work to strive for greatness? Isn't being good, being successful, maybe just enough?
It's the ultimate question, isn't it? The research offers a few angles on this. First, maybe surprisingly, it suggests that using these disciplined ideas doesn't actually make reaching greatness statistically harder or rarer than just perpetuating mediocrity.
Wait, it's not harder to be great than mediocre.
And maybe, just maybe, it involves less suffering. Think about the comparison companies stuck in the doom loop, all that lurching, reacting, internal chaos, wasted effort. That sounds incredibly stressful and painful. The good to great companies, with their clarity and discipline, might have actually experienced less internal turmoil even though they were working hard.
Less suffering by aiming higher. That really is counterintuitive.
Consider the energy. Pushing that flywheel, seeing progress, even if it's hard work, it adds energy to the system. People get excited, motivated by results, perpetuating mediocrity, dealing with inconsistency and lack of focus. That just drains energy. Clarity and discipline, counterintuitively, might simplify things and feel less exhausting in the long run than constant reaction.
So clarity and discipline could actually be less draining than chaos.
Okay.
But is there a deeper reason?
The researchers concluded the deepest answer to why greatness comes down to the human search for meaning in work. If you genuinely deeply care about what you do, your craft, your mission, the people you serve, the team you're part of, then striving to make it the best it can possibly be becomes almost natural, automatic.
It's not just about beating the competition or making more money.
Not fundamentally, no. It's more intrinsic, like that cross-country coach pouring energy into the team because they love the sport and developing young people. Or Bill Hewlett feeling immense pride in HP's values and contribution beyond just profits. Or Ken Iverson at Nucor, driven by a powerful sense of purpose around his people and their way of working, or even just loving the business you're in, like the founders of Kroger or Walgreens seem to, and wanting to make it excellent. If you care that deeply, the question why greatness almost doesn't make sense. The real question becomes, okay, how do we do it?
And this research gives us a data-driven how, a framework based on what actually worked.
It offers a powerful framework, yes, based on empirical evidence. It's crucial to remember, though, as the research also showed by tracking companies later, Even good to great companies aren't immune. If they stop applying these principles like Rubbermaid seemed to after Galt left, or Nucor after Iverson retired, they can decline. Greatness has to be continually renewed through discipline.
So it's not a one-time fix, it's an ongoing commitment.
Exactly. And just to be clear, when we talk about Philip Morris being included, it's based strictly on their financial performance meeting the study's criteria relative to their comparison company, RGR Nabisco, during that period. The research focused empirically on the pattern of achieving sustained, superior results and the internal disciplines correlated with it, independent of the nature of the industry itself.
Right. The research studied the mechanism of transformation based on the data, not making a judgment on the business itself.
Precisely. It's about understanding how these specific disciplines correlated with that specific definition of great results.
Okay, so the core message really feels empowering. Greatness isn't just about luck or genius or being in the right industry at the right time. It seems to be much more about conscious choice, about the discipline, consistent application of these specific principles over the long haul.
I think that's the central takeaway. It provides a potential path, a framework grounded in evidence for building something truly great no matter where you start or what challenges you face.
All right, so just to quickly recap this really fascinating deep dive, we've seen that moving from good to great seems to involve cultivating level 5 leaders, that paradoxical mix of personal humility and intense professional will. It requires putting first who, then what, getting the right people in the right seats before figuring out the direction. It demands the psychological discipline of the Stockdale Paradox, confronting the brutal facts while keeping unwavering faith. It means finding clarity through the Hedgehog Concept, understanding what you can be best at, what drives your economic engine, and what you're passionate about. It's about building momentum relentlessly through the flywheel effect, not seeking silver bullets. And it's grounded in a culture of discipline, empowering disciplined people within a clear framework, using technology as a carefully chosen accelerator.
That's a great summary. These aren't just abstract concepts. They feel like tangible, actionable principles for building any kind of great organization based on disciplined people, disciplined thought, and disciplined action. They offer real clarity.
And they definitely challenge a lot of the standard business advice we often hear.
They really do. Makes you rethink things.
So here's a final thought for you, our listener, to maybe chew on after this deep dive. If greatness isn't primarily about your circumstances, if it's largely a matter of conscious choice and consistently applying these kinds of disciplines, what's one area, just one area in your life or your work or maybe an organization you care deeply about where you could start pushing that flywheel today? Maybe just one small disciplined turn.
Where could you apply that combination of disciplined action, guided by some clarity about your own hedgehog intersection, even if it feels like a tiny push to start?
Because the journey to greatness, it seems, starts with that first turn of the flywheel.